one choice, one moment, one love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. Let's see if she even understands what respect sounds like. Sebastian Crow said in flawless, old Kyoto Japanese, not bothering to look up from his phone as he adjusted the cuff of his $8,000 suit. His voice low but deliberate, crafted for one purpose only, to be heard by those who shouldn't understand it, and ignored by the one standing right in front of him. The restaurant hummed softly under golden chandelier light. Glasses clinked, quiet laughter drifted across marble floors, and Alara Quinn stood there in her simple black and white uniform, order pad resting lightly in her hand, her posture calm, almost still, as if the noise of the room moved around her instead of through her, and for a brief second, nothing happened, not a reaction, not a flinch, not even a blink that gave away whether she understood a single word, and that was exactly what Sebastian expected. Because people like her never did, not in his world, not in his experience, not in the carefully controlled reality he had built where language was power and power belonged to him. He tapped the table once, impatient, switching smoothly into German, then blending in a phrase of archaic phrasing meant to confuse, amuse himself, and subtly mock, the kind of linguistic cocktail he had perfected over years of international dominance, a private game he played whenever boredom crept in. Because billion-dollar decisions lost their thrill when everyone around you said yes too quickly. Across the table, one of his associates smirked, another leaned back, already entertained by the familiar routine, while a visiting client from Tokyo raised an eyebrow, sensing something more layered beneath the casual cruelty. And still, Alara wrote nothing down, her pen hovering just above the paper as if waiting for something. Not the order, but the moment. Sebastian finally glanced up, expecting confusion, maybe a polite apology, maybe that slight nervous laugh servers used when they didn't understand, but didn't want to offend. But instead he met a pair of steady eyes, quiet, observant, unreadable, and for a fraction of a second, something in that stillness disrupted the rhythm he controlled so effortlessly, but he dismissed it, because he always did, because control was easier than curiosity. Well, he added in English now, his tone sharper, as if granting her a chance to recover from a test she had already failed in his mind, and around them, the air shifted just enough for a few nearby tables to notice, not the words, but the tension, the subtle imbalance that came when someone with power decided to use it. Casually, Alara closed her order pad gently, not hurried, not hesitant, just precise, and set the pen against it with a soft click that somehow carried through the noise. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost soft, but clear enough to land exactly where it needed to. You just asked for a dish that doesn't exist, mispronounced it in 3 different languages, and insulted the chef using a dialect that hasn't been used correctly in over a century. And then, without raising her voice, without shifting her posture, she repeated his entire order, perfectly, in the same old Kyoto dialect, each syllable placed with effortless accuracy, the kind that didn't come from memorization, but from understanding, deep and quiet and undeniable. The table froze, not dramatically, not loudly, just a subtle stillness, like the moment before something breaks or changes. And the Tokyo client leaned forward slightly, his expression no longer amused but intrigued, because he knew exactly what he had just heard, and more importantly, what it meant. Sebastian didn't speak, not immediately, and that was new, because silence was never his move, not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, not anywhere. But here, in this unexpected moment, something had shifted just enough that even he felt it, though he couldn't yet name it. Alara gave a small, almost polite nod, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, and added, "Would you like to place your actual order, sir?" The question simple, professional, but carrying a weight that no one in that room missed, because it wasn't just a question about food, it was a quiet return of balance, a subtle correction of something that had tilted too far, and somewhere between the clink of a glass and the hum of a passing conversation, Sebastian Crow realized, for the first time that evening, that he had just been understood, and that unsettled him far more than being challenged ever could. The room did not return to normal right away, even though the music kept playing and the servers continued moving between tables as if nothing had shifted, because something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, and Sebastian Crow felt it in the way the air seemed to pause just a fraction longer than usual before each sound settled back into place. He leaned back slowly, fingers resting against the edge of the table, studying Alara Quinn not as a server now, but as a variable he had not accounted for, and that alone made him uncomfortable in a way he rarely experienced, because unpredictability was something he eliminated, not entertained. Across from him, his associate Daniel cleared his throat, attempting to dissolve the tension with a light chuckle. Well, that was impressive, but even he did not quite meet Sebastian's eyes, as if unsure whether this moment belonged to humor or something closer to respect. The Tokyo client, Mr. Hayashi, did not smile at all. Instead, he inclined his head slightly toward Alara, a gesture subtle but meaningful. Your pronunciation was precise, he said carefully in English, his tone carrying a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be explained, and Alara responded with the same calm neutrality she had shown from the beginning. Thank you, sir, before shifting her attention back to Sebastian, not demanding, not challenging, simply waiting. That was the part that unsettled him most. Not what she had said, but what she had not done. She had not tried to prove anything further, had not lingered for validation, had not even allowed the moment to grow beyond its natural size. She had simply corrected him and moved on, as if the balance of the room had been restored and nothing more needed to be said. Sebastian picked up the menu again, though he had not truly been reading it before, and this time his voice, when he spoke, was in plain English, controlled, measured, grilled sea bass, medium, and sparkling water. And for the first time that evening, there was no performance in his tone, no layered intent beneath the words, just clarity, and Alara nodded once, writing it down with the same steady hand. Of course, before turning away with quiet efficiency, her steps neither hurried nor slow, just precise, as if every movement had already been decided long before she took it. Sebastian watched her walk away, something unfamiliar threading through his thoughts, not irritation, not even curiosity in its usual sharp form, but something quieter, something that did not demand immediate resolution, and that unsettled him more than any confrontation ever had. You are unusually quiet, Daniel muttered under his breath, leaning slightly closer. Usually by now you would have turned this into a lecture about cultural nuance. And Sebastian did not respond right away, because for once, he did not have a ready answer that fit neatly into his usual patterns, and that absence lingered. Longer than he expected, the meal arrived minutes later, perfectly plated, the aroma subtle but refined, and Alara placed each item with careful precision, aligning the silverware, adjusting the glass slightly so that it caught the light just enough. Small details most people never noticed, but Sebastian did, because details were where control lived. And yet here, those details did not feel like something he commanded. They felt like something he was being invited to observe. Is there anything else you need? She asked, her voice steady. And for a brief second, Sebastian considered testing her again. Another language, another shift, another attempt to reclaim the upper ground he was used to standing on. But the thought faded before it could take shape, replaced by something quieter, something that felt almost like restraint, though he would not have called it that. No, he said simply, and that single word carried less certainty than any statement he had made that evening. Alara nodded once more and stepped away, disappearing back into the rhythm of the restaurant, blending into the flow without effort, and yet somehow remaining distinct in a way that did not draw attention but refused to be ignored. As the conversation at the table resumed, business topics returning like a script everyone knew by heart, Sebastian found himself only half listening, his gaze drifting occasionally toward the far side of the room where Alara moved between tables, her presence consistent, unshaken, as if nothing about the earlier exchange had altered her at all, and that, more than anything, created a quiet fracture in the certainty he had carried into the night, because for the first time in a long time, Sebastian Crow was not thinking about how to control the next move. He was thinking about how someone else had chosen not to play the game at all, and why that felt like a loss he could not quite explain. By the time the check arrived, the rhythm of the restaurant had fully reclaimed itself, but something in Sebastian Crow had not returned to its usual order, and that difference followed him even as he signed the receipt with a smooth, practiced motion that had closed deals worth hundreds of millions, yet now felt strangely insignificant against a moment he could not categorize. He stood, adjusting his jacket, and for a brief second his eyes scanned the room not for exits or opportunities, but for her. And he found Alara Quinn near the far corner, speaking softly to an elderly couple, her expression composed, attentive, present in a way that did not seek attention yet somehow held it. He hesitated, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for himself to register that hesitation, and then he walked toward her, each step measured, controlled, as if approaching a negotiation where the rules had not yet been defined. She noticed him before he spoke, her gaze lifting, with quiet awareness, not surprised, not expectant, simply acknowledging his presence as it arrived, and that calm recognition unsettled him more than if she had seemed impressed. "You corrected me," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge, not an accusation, not quite a compliment, just a statement seeking its own meaning. Alara tilted her head slightly, considering the words rather than reacting to them. "You asked to be understood," she replied, her tone even, as if clarifying something obvious rather than challenging him. And for a moment, Sebastian almost smiled, not out of amusement, but because the simplicity of her answer revealed how unnecessarily complex he often made things. "Most people would have stayed quiet," he said, watching her carefully, testing not her knowledge now, but her reasoning, her intent. Alara's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in her eyes, something warmer, almost reflective. "Most people are not trying to prove a point," she said, and then, after a small pause that felt intentional, "they are just trying to get through their shift," and that landed differently than anything she had said before, because it carried no judgment, only truth, and truth, Sebastian realized, did not need to raise its voice to be heard. Behind them, a glass clinked, a server called out an order, the world continued, but within that small space, the conversation held a stillness that did not belong to the rest of the room. "And you?" he asked, the question slipping out before he refined it. "What are you trying to do?" And this time, Alara did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the city lights shimmered against the dark glass, reflections layered over movement, before returning to him with that same steady calm. "Listen," she said simply, and something in that single word carried more weight than the languages he had used earlier, because it was not about speaking at all. Sebastian exhaled softly, a habit he had developed to maintain composure in tense negotiations, but here it felt less like control and more like acknowledgement, as if he were recognizing a rule he had overlooked. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, the gesture automatic, familiar, the gateway to every connection he had ever built, and held it out toward her. "If you ever decide you would rather use those skills somewhere they are better compensated," he said, the phrasing careful, measured, avoiding anything that might sound like pity or assumption. Alara glanced at the card, then back at him, and for a moment, the faintest hint of amusement touched her expression, not mocking, not dismissive, just aware. "I am already using them," she replied, and the way she said it made the offer feel unnecessary rather than generous. Sebastian paused, the card still extended for a second longer than usual, before lowering it slowly, not offended, not rejected, just adjusted, as if recalibrating something internal. "Then I suppose I will have to find a better reason," he said quietly, and this time, the words carried something new, not a test, not a challenge, but a beginning of something he did not yet understand. Alara gave a small nod, acknowledging the shift without emphasizing it, and stepped back slightly as another table signaled for her attention. "Good evening, Mr. Crow," she said, her tone returning to its professional ease, yet leaving behind an echo of something more personal, something unspoken but present. As Sebastian turned to leave, the city beyond the glass seemed sharper, more defined, the noise clearer, the movement more deliberate. And for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about the next acquisition, the next strategy, the next move. He was thinking about a single word that had quietly undone his assumptions. And as he stepped out into the cool night air, he realized that understanding someone did not begin with speaking louder or smarter. It began with choosing, for once, not to dominate the conversation, but to hear it. The night air outside carried a quiet chill, the kind that settled into the edges of the city and softened its constant motion, and Sebastian Crow stood for a moment longer than necessary beside the sleek black car waiting at the curb, his driver holding the door open with practiced patience. But Sebastian did not move immediately, because something about the evening refused to close as cleanly as his usual transactions did. He finally stepped inside, the door shutting with a muted finality. Yet his thoughts remained somewhere behind, in the warm glow of the restaurant where a waitress had chosen not to impress him, not to fear him, but simply to understand him, and that difference lingered. "Home, sir?" the driver asked, voice respectful, neutral, and Sebastian hesitated just enough to notice it himself. "Office," he said instead, his tone quiet, almost thoughtful, as the car pulled smoothly into the flow of traffic, headlights stretching across the wet pavement like lines of moving light. The drive took 20 minutes, but it passed without his usual routine of reviewing reports or answering messages. His phone remained untouched beside him, an unusual stillness in a life built on constant response. And when he arrived at the glass tower that carried his name, the building greeted him with silence, the late hour leaving most floors dark except for a few scattered lights, reminders of people still chasing something he had already caught years ago. Inside his office, the city spread out beneath him, thousands of windows, thousands of stories, and for once, Sebastian did not see opportunity in them. He saw distance. He loosened his tie slightly, walking toward his desk, but instead of sitting, he stopped at the window, his reflection faint against the glass, layered over the city beyond, and he replayed the moment, not the words, but the pause before them, the way Alara had waited, not reacting, not rushing, just choosing the exact moment to speak, as if timing itself were part of the language she understood. He turned away, pressing a button on his desk. "Get me a background on Alara Quinn," he said into the quiet intercom, his voice returning to its familiar clarity, but something beneath it had shifted, not urgency, not suspicion, just interest, and that alone changed the weight of the request. "Full profile, education, employment, anything relevant," he added, and the response came quickly, efficient as always. "Of course, sir," before the line went silent again. Sebastian sat down then, finally, but instead of opening financial projections or market analyses, he reached for a blank notepad, something he rarely used, his work existing almost entirely in digital precision. Yet now he wrote a single word at the top of the page, slowly, deliberately, as if testing its shape. "Listen." He stared at it for a moment, the ink still fresh, and for the first time in years, he questioned something he had always assumed was strength, the need to speak first, to speak best, to speak last. And as the city lights flickered below, he wondered what he had missed in all the conversations he had already won. Hours passed quietly, and when the report finally arrived in his inbox, he did not open it right away, the notification sitting there, waiting, but no longer controlling the moment. And when he did tap the screen, his expression shifted almost immediately, not dramatically, just enough to register that what he expected was not what he found. The file was thin, unusually so, basic employment records, a few scattered academic entries, nothing that explained fluency across multiple complex languages, nothing that justified the precision he had witnessed. And Sebastian leaned back slightly, the chair moving just a fraction, because absence of information was something he understood well. It meant one of two things. Either there was nothing there, or there was something someone had chosen to keep hidden. He closed the file slowly, not frustrated, not yet, just aware, and returned his gaze to the city, the word on the notepad still visible at the edge of his vision. "Listen." And for once, instead of pushing forward, instead of demanding answers, Sebastian Crow allowed the silence to remain, not as a gap to fill, but as something to understand, because somewhere between the languages he had mastered and the words he had controlled, he had encountered something he could not command, and that realization, quiet and steady, followed him long after the office lights dimmed and the city moved on without him. Morning did not rush him, and that alone felt unfamiliar. The city woke in layers of quiet light, but Sebastian Crow had already been standing by the window for several minutes, the skyline stretching out beneath him like something he used to control, something predictable, something measurable. And yet this morning, his attention was not on the buildings, not on the movement, but on a single absence he could not resolve. The report sat open on his tablet, thin, incomplete, almost dismissive, in its lack of answers, and he read it again, slower this time, not searching for information, but for intention, for the reason why something so clearly present in reality had left so little trace on paper. Alara Quinn, limited records, fragmented education, no formal conclusion, no visible trajectory that aligned with what he had heard, what he had seen, what he could not explain. Sebastian closed the file, then opened it again, then closed it once more, his movements precise but no longer automatic. Because for the first time, data was not leading him forward, it was stopping him. He exhaled slowly, resting one hand against the edge of his desk, his reflection faint in the glass beyond, layered over a city that continued without waiting for his decision. This was unnecessary, he thought, the kind of detour he would normally eliminate without hesitation, inefficient, unstructured, outside the systems he trusted, and yet the thought did not leave. It lingered, quiet but persistent, refusing to be dismissed. He turned away from the window, walking toward the center of the room, then stopping again, because something in him resisted the next step, not out of fear, but out of unfamiliarity, as if he were about to act without a clear outcome, without control, and that alone felt like a mistake. For a moment, he considered letting it go, returning to the schedule already waiting for him, the meetings, the decisions, the certainty of a world where everything followed logic, where every move had a reason, where nothing was left unresolved. He could leave it there, a single, unusual encounter, nothing more, and no one would question it. No one would expect anything different. His hand hovered near the desk, then lowered slowly, and he looked at the notepad again, the words still there, unchanged. Listen. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than complexity ever had, because it required something he had not practiced, not perfected, not controlled. He reached for the intercom, then paused again, a second hesitation, smaller but sharper, because once he made the decision, it would break pattern, and Sebastian Crow did not break pattern without reason. And yet, this time, reason was not clear, not defined, just present in a way that could not be ignored. Clear my schedule for this afternoon, he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that came from choosing something without certainty. And there was a brief silence on the other end, subtle but noticeable, because this was not routine. All of it, sir, came the reply, and Sebastian's answer did not waver. All of it, he said, and when the line went quiet again, the room felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because something internal had shifted, something small, but irreversible. Hours later, the car moved through the city with its usual quiet efficiency, the world outside passing in controlled motion. But inside, Sebastian remained still, his gaze unfocused, not reviewing information, not preparing strategy, just allowing the thought to remain without forcing it into structure. When the car slowed, pulling up to a street he would have overlooked any other day, he did not step out immediately. He remained seated for a moment longer, looking through the window at a place that held no advantage, no status, no reason for him to be there. And again, the hesitation returned, softer now, but still present. This is unnecessary. The thought came again, clearer this time, and for a brief second, he almost accepted it, almost gave in to the version of himself that would turn away, return to what was known, what was controlled, what made sense. His hand moved toward the door, then stopped, the pause lasting just long enough to matter, and then, without overthinking, without reframing, he stepped out. The air outside felt different, not because it was, but because he was noticing it, the quiet between sounds, the space between movement, details he had never needed to consider before. He stood there for a moment, taking in the simplicity of the place, the absence of expectation, and then he turned, not quickly, not decisively, but deliberately, and walked inside, leaving behind, just for a moment, the version of himself that always needed to know exactly why. The room did not change for him, and that was the first thing Sebastian Crow noticed. Not the voices, not the mismatched chairs, not even the way the afternoon light filtered through the worn blinds and uneven lines, but the fact that nothing adjusted to his presence. No one paused, no one straightened, no one whispered his name. And for a man whose arrival usually shifted entire rooms without a word, that absence felt almost unfamiliar, almost grounding. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, hands relaxed at his sides, observing not as a strategist, but as a witness. And what he saw was something he could not measure in numbers, not in percentages or projections, but in small, precise moments. A girl sounding out a sentence slowly, a boy correcting himself without being told, a quiet laugh when someone finally got it right. And at the center of it, Elara Quinn, moving through it all with a calm that did not demand attention yet held it completely. She did not raise her voice, did not rush, did not correct harshly. Instead, she adjusted, guided, waited, as if she understood that learning was not about speed, but about timing. And Sebastian found himself watching not the outcome, but the process, something he rarely allowed himself to do. "You are early," she said without turning, her voice reaching him as she finished helping a child pronounce a difficult phrase. And when she finally looked at him, there was no surprise in her expression, only acknowledgement, as if his presence had already been accounted for in the quiet structure of the afternoon. "I cleared my schedule," he replied, the words simple, but carrying a weight that would have surprised anyone who knew how rarely he said them. And Elara nodded once, not impressed, not dismissive, just accepting the statement for what it was. "Then you have time," she said. And something about the way she said it made time feel less like something to manage and more like something to use. She gestured toward an empty chair at the edge of the circle, not an invitation in the formal sense, not an introduction, just a space made available. And Sebastian hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward and sitting down. The chair slightly smaller than what he was used to, the angle unfamiliar, placing him not above or apart, but among, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed the way he experienced everything that followed. A young boy glanced at him curiously, whispering something to the girl beside him, and she whispered back, both of them smiling in that unfiltered way that carried no agenda, no expectation. And Sebastian gave a small nod in return, unsure of the protocol, realizing there was none. "We are working on introductions," Elara said, her tone steady as she addressed the group. Simple sentences, nothing complicated. And then she looked at Sebastian briefly, not calling him out, not placing attention on him, but including him without making it a moment. "You can start when you are ready," she added. And for the first time in a long time, Sebastian Crow did not have a prepared opening. No rehearsed clarity, no controlled phrasing, just a simple space where words were expected but not demanded. He glanced around the circle, at the children who were watching him not with intimidation but with curiosity, and he realized something quietly important. They were not measuring him. They were not waiting to be impressed. They were simply waiting to understand. "My name is Sebastian," he said finally, his voice steady but softer than usual, and the sentence felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity. Stripped of titles, stripped of weight, just a name, and that alone shifted something within him. The boy across from him grinned, repeating the structure back in his own attempt, misplacing a word, correcting himself, and Elara nodded gently. "Better," she said, and the room continued, the rhythm unbroken, the focus never lingering too long on any one person, including him. Time moved differently there, not marked by meetings or deadlines, but by progress measured in understanding. And Sebastian found himself leaning forward slightly, listening more closely, not for mistakes, not for opportunities to correct, but for meaning, for intention, for the quiet effort behind each word. At one point, a girl struggled with a phrase, frustration flickering across her face, and Sebastian instinctively began to speak, to offer a correction, to step in the way he always had in every environment. But he stopped himself, the word on the notepad from the night before rising quietly in his mind. "Listen." And so he did. He stayed silent, allowing Elara to guide the moment instead, her voice calm, patient, giving the girl space to find the answer on her own. And when she did, the small victory that followed filled the room with a kind of satisfaction that no negotiation had ever given him. Hours passed without urgency, and when the session finally began to wind down, the children gathering their things, their voices softening into casual conversation, Sebastian remained seated for a moment longer, as if adjusting to the return of a world where everything moved faster, louder, more demanding. Alara approached him then, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. "You did not speak much," she observed, not as criticism, not as praise, just as fact, and Sebastian gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I was listening," he said, and this time, the words carried certainty, not because they were perfect, but because they were true. And Alara's gaze held his for a brief moment before she gave a slight smile. "Barely there, but enough." "Then you are learning," she replied, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to suggest that whatever this was, it was only just beginning. The late afternoon light had softened by the time the last child left the room, their footsteps fading down the hallway, their voices dissolving into distant echoes of laughter and unfinished sentences, and for a moment, the space settled into a quiet that felt earned rather than empty, the kind of silence that followed effort, not absence. Sebastian Crow remained seated, his hands resting loosely against his knees, his posture no longer carrying the rigid precision it once held, and he watched as Alara Quinn moved through the room, stacking chairs, aligning notebooks, small motions done without rush, without wasted energy, as if even the ending of a day had its own rhythm she respected. "You stayed," she said after a while, not looking at him directly, her voice calm, observational, as she adjusted a stack of papers into a neat line, and Sebastian gave a slight nod, though the gesture felt less like an answer and more like an acknowledgement of something he had not planned but had chosen anyway. "I did not have anywhere more important to be," he replied, and the honesty in his tone surprised even him, because for most of his life, there had always been somewhere more important, something more urgent, something that demanded his presence. But here, in this room, urgency had been replaced by something quieter, something that did not push, but invited. Alara glanced at him. Briefly, a subtle shift in her gaze that carried curiosity without intrusion. "That is new for you," she said, and it was not a question, and Sebastian almost smiled at that, the way she stated things as if she had already listened enough to understand patterns he had not yet recognized himself. He stood then, slowly, the movement unhurried, and for a moment, they simply existed in the same space without speaking, the quiet between them no longer uncomfortable, no longer something to fill, but something to share. "You teach them differently," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "You do not correct them immediately." And Alara paused, considering his observation, her hands resting lightly against the back of a chair. "If you correct too quickly, they stop trying," she said, her tone even. "And if they stop trying, they stop learning." And the simplicity of it settled into him with more weight than any complex strategy he had ever studied, because it applied beyond language, beyond the room, beyond everything he had built. Sebastian looked down briefly, absorbing the idea, then back at her. "In my world, mistakes are not encouraged," he admitted, the phrasing careful, as if stepping into unfamiliar territory, and Alara nodded slightly, not dismissing his world, not challenging it, just acknowledging it as it was. "In your world, mistakes cost money," she said, and then, after a small pause, "In theirs, mistakes build confidence." And the contrast hung there, quiet but undeniable, and Sebastian realized that both could be true, yet he had only ever allowed one to exist. Outside, the light shifted again, the sky moving toward evening, and through the window, the city carried on, unaware of the small recalibrations happening inside a room it would never notice. "Why did you stop?" he asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could refine it. "The studies, the work, the path that leads somewhere else." And Alara did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting toward the window for a brief second, not avoiding the question, but choosing the right way to hold it. And when she spoke, her voice was softer, but steady. "Because somewhere else is not always better," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no regret, just a clarity that suggested the decision had been made long before this moment. Sebastian considered that, the idea that value was not always tied to scale, not always measured by reach or recognition. And for someone who had built everything on expansion, on growth, on more, the thought settled into him with quiet resistance. but also with something else, something that felt like understanding. He reached into his jacket again, but this time, he did not take out a card, did not make an offer, did not try to translate the moment into something transactional. Instead, he let his hand fall back to his side, choosing not to interrupt what did not need to be changed. "I would like to come back," he said after a moment. The words simple, unadorned, and Alara met his gaze, not surprised, not hesitant, just present. "Then come back," she replied, as if the answer had always been that straightforward. A faint smile touched the corner of his expression then, not the practiced kind he used in negotiations, but something quieter, less certain, and perhaps more real. And as he turned toward the door, stepping back into the hallway where the world began to pick up its familiar pace again, he realized that for the first time, returning to a place was not about obligation, not about advantage, but about something he had not yet named, something that did not demand to be understood immediately, only experienced, and that, more than anything, made him pause just long enough to recognize that whatever this was, it was no longer about a single moment in a restaurant. It was becoming something that followed him, something that stayed. The evening settled slowly over the city, not with noise, but with a kind of quiet transition that most people never noticed, the shift from movement to reflection, from urgency to something softer. And in that space, Sebastian Crow found himself returning, not because it was scheduled, not because it was required, but because something within him had begun to recognize the value of a place that asked nothing from him except presence. The community center looked the same as before, unchanged, unpolished, and yet it no longer felt unfamiliar. And as he stepped inside, the faint echo of voices greeted him again. Smaller tonight, fewer children, a more intimate circle, and Alara Quinn stood near the front, guiding a discussion rather than a lesson, her tone steady, her posture relaxed, as if the room itself moved with her rather than around her. She noticed him without interruption, a brief glance, a small acknowledgement, and then she continued speaking, allowing him to enter without shifting the balance of what was already happening. And Sebastian took his place quietly, not at the edge this time, but closer, not central, not distant, just present. The conversation moved between languages, phrases exchanged, meanings explored, not corrected immediately but allowed to form, to stretch, to settle into understanding. And Sebastian listened again, more carefully now, not just to the words, but to the pauses between them, the moments where meaning was shaped before it was spoken. At one point, a teenage girl hesitated over a sentence, unsure of the phrasing, her voice trailing off as she searched for the right structure. And before Sebastian could think, he leaned forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to offer. "You are close," he said gently, his tone measured, echoing something he had heard before. "Try it again, slower." And the girl looked at him, surprised but not intimidated. And she tried again, adjusting the words, finding the rhythm, and when she finished, Alara nodded once, her gaze briefly meeting Sebastian's, not praising, not correcting, just recognizing the shift. And in that small exchange, something aligned, not perfectly, but enough. The session continued, and this time, Sebastian did not feel like an observer. He felt like a participant, not leading, not controlling, just contributing when it was needed, and staying silent when it was not. And the difference was subtle, but it carried weight. After the session ended, the room once again settled into its quiet order. Chairs moved, notebooks closed, the soft sounds of an evening winding down. And Alara approached him with the same calm presence. "You spoke," she said, not as a question, not as a surprise, just as a simple observation. And Sebastian allowed a faint smile, the kind that did not try to prove anything. Only when it mattered. He replied, and the words felt balanced, not defensive, not performative, just accurate. Alara considered that for a moment, then nodded slightly. "That is the difference," she said. And they stood there, not rushed, not lingering unnecessarily, just sharing the space as it transitioned from one moment to the next. Outside, the air carried a softer edge than the night before, and as they stepped out together, the city lights reflecting in the glass around them, Sebastian found himself noticing details he would have once ignored, the quiet rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalk, the way conversations blended without competing, the the subtle patterns of a world that did not revolve around control, but around coexistence. You came back, Alara said after a few steps, her voice steady, and Sebastian glanced at her briefly. I said, I would, he replied, and then, after a short pause, and I wanted to. And that addition, small as it was, shifted the meaning entirely. Alara's gaze remained forward, but there was a softness there now, not visible to most, but present, and it did not need to be explained. They reached the corner where their paths would separate, the moment naturally arriving without being forced, and Sebastian hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, as if recognizing that some moments were not meant to be rushed past. There is a dinner, he said, his voice quieter than before, not commanding, not persuasive, just offering, not a business one, not a test, just dinner. And for the first time since they had met, the words carried no hidden structure, no layered intent, just a simple invitation. Alara looked at him then, fully, her expression calm, thoughtful, and for a moment, she did not answer, not because she needed time, but because she chose it, and then she said, only if you speak your own language, her tone light, but her meaning clear, and Sebastian nodded, a small, genuine gesture. I will try, he said, and that was enough. They parted without ceremony, without lingering words, but as Sebastian walked back toward the waiting car, something within him felt different, not complete, not resolved, but moving, shifting, opening. And for once, he did not try to define it immediately. He simply allowed it to exist, because somewhere between the languages he had mastered and the silence he had learned to respect, he had found something that did not need to be translated to be understood. The restaurant looked different that night, not because anything had changed in its design. The same golden lights, the same polished glass, the same quiet hum of conversations drifting between tables, but because Sebastian Crow did not walk into it as the same man who had once used it as a stage for control, and when he stepped inside, there was no calculated pause, no expectation of attention, just a quiet awareness of where he was and why he had come. He chose a table near the window, not the most central, not the most private, simply a place where the city lights could reflect softly against the glass. And for the first time in years, he did not check his watch, did not reach for his phone, did not measure the moment against anything else. He just waited. When Alara Quinn approached, her steps steady, her presence calm, there was a brief flicker of recognition in her eyes, not surprise, not curiosity, just acknowledgement, and she stopped beside the table, not as a server, greeting a guest, but as someone meeting a moment that had already been understood. Good evening, she said, her tone even, and Sebastian looked up, meeting her gaze without hesitation. Good evening. He replied, the words simple, unlayered, carrying no hidden meaning, and for a second, that simplicity held more weight than anything he had ever said in multiple languages. She did not take out her order pad immediately, did not shift into routine. She simply stood there, allowing the moment to exist, and Sebastian took a breath, not to steady himself, but to choose his words carefully, not for precision, but for honesty. I would like to have dinner with you, he said, his voice calm, not commanding, not persuasive, just clear. Not as my waitress, he added after a brief pause, as yourself. And the room around them continued as it always had, unaware of the quiet shift happening at one table. Alara studied him for a moment, not searching for flaws, not testing for intention, just listening, truly listening. And in that silence, Sebastian did not rush to fill the space, did not offer more, did not explain. He allowed the question to stand on its own. Then, slowly, she nodded, a small, deliberate movement. After my shift, she said, her voice steady. And that was all it needed to be, no conditions, no hesitation, just a decision made with clarity. Hours later, the city had settled into a softer rhythm, the rush of the evening easing into the quiet of night, and they sat across from each other at a small table outside, not extravagant, not curated. Just a simple place where the air carried the faint sound of distant traffic and the occasional laughter of strangers passing by. There were no business cards, no structured conversations, no careful negotiations, just words, slower this time, unguarded, and pauses that were not uncomfortable, but natural, as if both of them understood that meaning did not always need to be immediate. Sebastian spoke less than he ever had on a first meeting, and when he did, it was not to impress, not to lead, but to share small pieces, honest ones, about how he had built something that had once felt complete, and how he had only recently realized that completion was not the same as understanding. Alara listened, her attention steady, not interrupting, not guiding, just present, and when she spoke, it was with the same quiet precision, not offering answers, not trying to change him, just adding perspective, allowing the conversation to move rather than directing it. At one point, he paused, searching for the right words, and then he stopped searching altogether, letting the silence hold the thought until it formed naturally. And when it did, it was simple. "I used to think language was about control," he said, his voice quieter now, "but I think I was wrong." And Alara met his gaze, her expression calm. "Language is about connection," she replied, and there was no emphasis, no need to underline the truth in it, because it was already clear. The night continued, not with dramatic moments, not with sudden declarations, but with something steadier, something that built quietly between them, understanding layered over shared time, respect shaped through listening. And when the conversation finally slowed, not ending, but resting, Sebastian leaned back slightly, a faint smile touching his expression, not practiced, not strategic, just real. "I am still learning," he said, and Alara returned the smallest smile, the kind that did not need to be seen by anyone else. "Good," she replied softly, "because so am I." And in that shared admission, something settled, not finished, not defined, but certain enough to exist without explanation. As they stood to leave, the city lights reflecting in the quiet glass around them, Sebastian did not reach for control, did not try to shape what came next. He simply walked beside her, their steps aligning without effort, and for the first time, he understood something that no language had ever taught him, that sometimes the most important conversations were not about what was said, but about who chose to stay and listen. And in that quiet understanding, he did not need to speak another word to know that this, whatever it was becoming, was real. If this story stayed with you, don't stop here. Like the video, share it with someone who believes in quiet strength, and let us know where you are watching from. And please subscribe to When He Chose Her channel for more powerful, emotional stories. Your support helps us keep telling stories that truly matter.